Millions of fans watched the New York Giants win two Super Bowls in the 1980s, behind the most dominant defensive player the league had ever produced. A linebacker so disruptive that offenses had to redesign their entire blocking schemes just to account for him. Two championships followed, built on a single defense's identity more than any roster before or since. But the man who built that identity spent the following 3 decades proving that greatness on a football field guarantees absolutely nothing about the man underneath the pads. This is where the New York Giants of the Lawrence Taylor era really ended up. One is the linebacker still regarded by many historians as the single most transformative defensive player the sport has ever produced, and whose life after football became one of the most difficult falls any Hall of Famer has ever had to answer for. Lawrence Taylor won the 1986 NFL Most Valuable Player Award, the last defensive player to win it outright for over 3 decades, anchoring both of New York's Super Bowl championship defenses and forcing offensive coordinators across the league to invent the modern blindside tackle position just to slow him down. Born in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1959, Taylor was the second overall pick in the 1981 draft out of North Carolina, and by his own later admission in a 2003 memoir, began using cocaine during his rookie season, a habit that spiraled through the rest of his playing career and deep into retirement. He was arrested repeatedly on drug charges through the 1990s, entered rehabilitation multiple times, and declared bankruptcy in 1998 after 5 years of federal probation for tax evasion. In May of 2010, at age 51, Taylor was arrested and charged with third-degree rape after paying $300 for sex with a 16-year-old runaway who had been beaten and trafficked into prostitution by another man. Taylor later said he believed she was 19. He pleaded guilty in 2011 to misdemeanor sexual misconduct and patronizing a prostitute, was sentenced to 6 years of probation, and was required to register as a sex offender, a status that led to a further arrest in 2023 after he failed to update his registered address. Taylor is alive today, in his mid-60s, still occasionally appearing in broadcasting and business ventures, carrying both a bronze bust in Canton and a permanent listing on a sex offender registry, two facts the sport has never quite figured out how to hold in the same sentence. Taylor redefined what a defensive player could do to an entire offensive game plan. Lawrence Taylor's own legacy has spent the years since split cleanly in two between the greatest football player many people who watched him ever saw and a criminal record involving a trafficked teenager that no amount of football brilliance has ever been able to erase. Two is the middle linebacker who captained New York's defense through both championships and who has spent the decades since telling anyone who will listen that knowing what he knows now, he never would have played the sport at all. Harry Carson served as the Giants team captain for 10 seasons, was named to 9 Pro Bowls, and was finally inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2006, 16 years after his own retirement, a weight that frustrated fans who considered him one of the era's most criminally underrated defenders. Born in Florence, South Carolina in 1953, Carson starred at South Carolina State before New York drafted him in 1976, and he estimates he suffered as many as 15 concussions across his 13-year career, none of them ever properly treated at the time under the standards of the era. He was diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome in 1990, 2 years after retiring, and has lived with ongoing memory issues, depression, and sensitivity to light and noise ever since, managing his symptoms for decades through exercise, diet, and repeated hyperbaric oxygen therapy sessions he pays for largely out of pocket. In a 2018 interview, Carson said plainly that given the chance to do it all over again, knowing what football's cumulative violence had done to his brain, he would not have played. He is alive today, in his early 70s, still a fixture in Giants alumni circles, and still one of the most outspoken former players in the country on the subject of what the game actually costs the men who play it. Carson captained a defense that redefined what New York football could be for an entire era. Harry Carson has spent 4 decades since football using a machine originally designed for scuba diving injuries, just to feel like himself for a few days at a time. Hey, before we get to the next name, if you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because these stories only get harder to forget. 3 is the tight end nicknamed Rambo for playing through injuries that would have ended most careers on the spot, whose toughest fight after football turned out to be an invisible one nobody could see coming. Mark Bavaro caught 66 passes for over 1,000 yards during New York's first Super Bowl championship season in 1986, becoming the only tight end in franchise history to reach that mark in a single year, and famously played through a broken jaw wired shut for multiple games that same season rather than come off the field. Born in Winthrop, Massachusetts in 1963, Bavaro starred at Notre Dame before New York drafted him in the fourth round in 1985, and quarterback Phil Simms later said that when healthy, Bavaro was simply the best tight end in football, a trailblazer whose blocking and receiving style is still copied by every tight end system in the modern NFL. A degenerative knee condition forced him out of football entirely in 1991, and after brief comeback stints with Cleveland and Philadelphia, he retired for good in 1995, at various points working as a high school assistant coach and later becoming a vocal pro-life activist. In more recent years, Bavaro has spoken about a severe case of long-term COVID-19 that significantly affected both his physical and mental health, a battle that proved, by his own account, unlike anything his playing career had ever prepared him for. He is alive today, in his early 60s, living with his wife Susan and their 3 children, one of the quieter members of this era's roster, whose post-football struggles played out almost entirely outside the public eye. Rambo Bavaro once played through a wired-shut jaw rather than miss a single down of a championship season. Mark Bavaro discovered decades later that the toughest opponent of his life wasn't a linebacker or a blown-out knee, but a virus that gave him no play to fight back against at all. 4 is the defensive end, who became the NFL's all-time leader in touchdowns scored by a defensive lineman, and who turned his own midlife crisis into a 3,000-mile walk across the entire country. George Martin played 14 seasons in New York, anchoring the defensive line through both Super Bowl championships, and famously returning a fumble 78 yards for a safety-turn touchdown that head coach Bill Parcells called the greatest single play he had ever witnessed on a football field. Born in Amityville, New York in 1953, Martin was a 11th round pick out of Oregon in 1975 and went on to serve as president of the NFL Players Association after his playing days ended, later building a career as a sports marketing executive. In 2007, inspired by watching close friend and teammate Harry Carson get inducted into the Hall of Fame, Martin decided, at age 54, to walk from the George Washington Bridge in New York to San Diego, California, roughly 3,000 miles over 10 months and 27 pairs of shoes, to raise money for the medical care of 9/11 first responders after losing 2 young family friends in the attacks. The walk ultimately raised more than $3 million for rescue and recovery workers. He is alive today, in his early 70s, still closely tied to the tight-knit '86 Giants team he helped anchor, having spent his post-football life turning his own platform toward causes that had nothing to do with football at all. Martin built one of the most productive individual careers any defensive lineman of his era ever put together. George Martin decided that the best use of the fame football gave him was walking the width of an entire country for people who ran toward danger, the same year his own sport was busy debating who deserved a bronze bust. 5 is the quarterback whose single Super Bowl performance still stands as one of the most efficient in the history of the game, and who built one of broadcasting's longest careers immediately afterward without ever needing his playing days to be the whole story. Phil Simms was named Super Bowl 21 MVP after completing 22 of 25 passes, a completion percentage record that still stands today, leading New York to a 39-20 rout of Denver that delivered the franchise's first championship of the Parcells era. Born in Springfield, Kentucky in 1955, Simms played his entire 15-year career with the Giants after being drafted 7th overall out of Morehead State in 1979, a selection so obscure at the time that Giants fans reportedly booed the pick loudly on draft day. He retired in 1993, holding nearly every meaningful passing record in franchise history, and moved almost immediately into broadcasting, spending nearly 2 decades as lead game analyst for CBS Sports, alongside Jim Nantz before transitioning to the network's studio pregame show. In the spring of 2026, Simms and longtime broadcast partner Boomer Esiason were both let go from CBS's pregame show as the network refreshed its lineup, closing out one of the longest continuous broadcasting careers of any player from this era. He is alive today, still connected to the Giants organization and its alumni community after 4 decades in the public eye. Sims authored a Super Bowl performance that has never been statistically matched since. Phil Simms spent nearly as long explaining football on television as he once spent playing it, and even his exit from the broadcast booth arrived on his own terms rather than through any crisis at all. If you've made it this far, and you're wondering who built this entire dynasty out of players this different from one another, the last name on this list is the coach, who somehow held all of them together at once. 6 is the head coach whose blue-collar intensity turned a struggling Giants franchise into back-to-back era champions, and whose own heart nearly cost him the chance to finish the job at all. Bill Parcells coached the Giants for 8 seasons, winning Super Bowl 21 and Super Bowl 25, before stepping down in 1991 citing serious heart problems that required surgery shortly afterward. Born in Englewood, New Jersey in 1941 and raised nearby in Hasbrook Heights, Parcells played linebacker at Wichita State before turning to coaching, taking over a Giants team that had gone 3-12-1 in his first season in 1983 and rebuilding it around Phil Simms, Lawrence Taylor, and the young core that would soon become a championship roster. Players and colleagues consistently described him as a coach who thrived on friction, someone who needed a running battle with at least one player at all times to keep the entire operation sharp. A personality Simms himself once called almost self-sabotaging whenever the team was actually playing well. After recovering from his heart surgery, Parcells returned to coaching with the New England Patriots in 1993, the New York Jets in 1997, and the Dallas Cowboys in 2003, becoming one of the only coaches in NFL history to lead 4 different franchises to the playoffs. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2013. He is alive today in his mid-80s, largely retired from football, but still occasionally consulted as one of the sport's most respected football minds. Parcells built a Giants dynasty out of players who came from wildly different backgrounds and, in some cases, wildly different personal struggles. Bill Parcells is still here today, having quietly outlasted the heart problems that nearly ended his own career, decades before several of the men he coached had to face harder problems of their own. They rest in nothing but memory so far, because every man on this list is still alive today. A rare outcome for a defense this violent and an era this complicated. One carries both a Hall of Fame bust and a permanent spot on a sex offender registry. One uses a hyperbaric chamber to manage the same brain injuries the sport never warned him about. One is still catching his breath from a virus tougher than any linebacker he ever blocked. The New York Giants of the Lawrence Taylor era built 2 championships around the most dominant defense football had ever seen. And decades later, the actual legacy of that defense turned out to be exactly as complicated as the man who anchored it.